Hello everyone and welcome to another incredible game you guys requested. It's from the second day of the Rapid section of the Croatian Grand Chess Tour, the game before the Magnus game. It's Gukesh with white versus Fabiano Caruana. And yes, Magnus can be considered the strongest opponent, but Fabiano is, I don't think anyone would say that it's easy to play against him regardless of whether you have white or black. If anything, going into any matchup, Fabi can be considered a favorite. Even Magnus, I think it was an interview he gave a couple of days ago, said that his toughest task ever was to play against Fabiano Caruana during their 2018 World Chess Championship match, as over the course of the 12 classical games, all 12 ended in a draw. So Fabi held Magnus to a draw, and then Magnus bested him only in rapid time format. And I think it was at around the game 10 or somewhere like that, where Fabi, had he won that game, he would overtake Magnus as world number one. So they were almost identical in rating. And this game, it's very hard to understand. Even with the help of an engine, I was able to maybe pinpoint one or two reasons why Gukesh was able to do what he has done. And, if you ask Gukesh, he would probably, give you a much more detailed explanation. But, we cannot, think or understand chess at that level. So we do what we can. So let's check it out and see why this game is so incredible and why you guys suggested it. So Gukesh with white opens with knight to f3. He goes for the Reti. We have pawn to d5, g3, going for the King's Indian attack, knight f6, we have bishop to g2, and pawn to e6, the Yugoslav variation of the King's Indian attack. We have pawn to c4, transposing into something like in English. We have bishop to e7 and pawn to b3. Now we are in the English. This is now the Agincourt defense. We have castles kingside, bishop to b2, and pawn to c5. And usually everyone castles here. Captures on d5 is the second most popular option, so they are still well within theory. C captures, knight captures. We have knight to c3 and knight to c6 by Fabi. And there are a couple of games here. For example, castles is a popular move. Knight captures on d5 also has been played. Gukesh plays pawn to h4, and it is now, as of move 9, that we have a completely new game. Okay, Fabi, this is the first moment where Fabi starts thinking. You can see that both of them are still almost at full time. Gukesh 25 minutes, Fabi 24 minutes. Fabi goes back, knight to f6. And he spends some 3 minutes on this idea. The other option would be maybe trade, knight captures, d captures, or bishop captures. Probably d captures, and then later on you can look for c4, where if queens get traded, you get the rook to d1. And then probably black declines, white also puts a queen on c2, and then the rooks go to the d file. The game goes on. Fabi decided for knight to f6, and like I said, this is the first move where Fabi spent some time. Castles kingside and pawn to e5. Okay, grabbing more space and fighting for that d4 square. So that means Fabi will try to prevent Gukesh from executing d4, and Gukesh will make it his business to at some point execute d4. We have rook to c1. And bishop to f5. Fabi nicely developing the bishop. We have pawn to d3. So it's not going to be an e3, d4, but probably d3, e3, and sometimes in the future d4 when the queen moves, the other rook comes to d1, and so on. So it has to be prepared to perfection. We have rook to c8. And knight to d2, saying that, okay, the knight might come to c4, the knight might come to e4, and Fabi could definitely invest a couple of moves into a6 and b5, but then, okay, what have you really done? And the knight probably just comes to e4 either way. So Fabi just goes bishop to e6. He says, if needed, I will capture on c4, but for the moment, let's just keep our options open. We have knight to c4 and knight to g4 by Fabi. Now, you can't really play something like f3. That would leave a pretty big hole on e3, and then if you play e4 at some point, you will never be able to play d4. So pawn to e3, now preparing d4, not right away, but at some point, and we have h5 by Fabi. Okay, we have queen to e2, preparing to get the rook into the game. Pawn to a6, Fabi now ready to kick the knight away with pawn to b5, and rook f to d1. we have pawn to b5, and the knight just goes back. We have knight to d2, and now f5 by Fabi. And looking at this objectively, Fabi can be very, very happy with his position. There's not a single piece he has that's doing nothing. The bishop at some point will come to f6. That bishop pair will be extremely strong, and he has, some f4 in the future, maybe e4. We'll get the queen into the game. And it looks like a very hard position for Gukesh to play. If anything, it looks like a position that has to be played to perfection in order just not to lose, which is kind of what Gukesh is doing every game. So he goes knight f3. And what does Fabi do here? The problem for Fabi is that he's already down to 5 minutes on the clock. Even though he has a very, very nice position. Gukesh has 17 minutes on the clock. And it's very hard for Fabi to make a move. Even, just looking at this position, what would you play? Would you go for some queen development and maybe bring the rook to the d file? Do you go for something like, what do you go for? I'm going to show you what the engine goes for because it's not something that you would think of. And the only way for Fabi to keep sort of having this positional edge is to go for knight b4 or bishop to f7 followed by knight to b4. The point is, after you go bishop to f7, you don't really have, or rather, it's better explained if I play knight to b4, because the problem is Gukesh wants to play d4. But now if you play d4, then Fabi has e4. And okay, you can play knight e1, saying, okay, I guard the d3 squared. There's no knight d3. But then you can play c4. And that's the problem. Now the knight is coming to d3, and black is positionally almost winning here. Same thing if you go bishop to f7 first. Let's say white goes something like white tries to double up to execute d4. Again, you will play knight to b4, and now if you kick away the knight, pawn to e3, okay, you kick the knight back, knight to c6. But now you still don't have support for d4. For example, queen d1, you will go knight a5. And now you have big problems here on the queen side. The knight is coming to b3. Not a lot you can do about this. So those are basically the intricacies of the position, and that is what Fabi has to go for. So he has to, go knight b4, either to prepare e4 and c4 to get an outpost for the knight on d3, or to force a3 and then weaken the b3 pawn. So that is the only thing Fabi can do in order to keep sort of this little edge that he has. Unfortunately, with 5 minutes on the clock, that's something an engine sees. Fabi played bishop to f6, and all of a sudden, Gukesh is perhaps not winning, but he's very, very close. I mean, it's going to be incredibly difficult to play this for Fabi. I've already told you why. Because now he has d4. Fabi has done nothing to stop d4. Bishop to f6 doesn't stop it. And he does it. Pawn to d4. And now you have big problems here. For example, if you capture with the e-pawn, then after you capture, the bishop on e6 is hanging. And then you're going to lose the c5 pawn as well. And at the end of the day, okay, it comes also with an attack on the queen. You will have, let's say, sorry, not queen captures. You will have a pass pawn on c5, which is already a huge deal. On the other hand, if you try the other way around, let's say you play c captures, then again, e captures on d4. And what are you playing? d5 is coming. d captures on e5 is coming. You cannot defend against all of these threats. If you play bishop d7, you're just going to capture on e5. And now, even though black can capture, look at this. Knight captures, knight d5. And again, black is lost here. It's hard to see why, but after a few moves, let's say rook captures on c1, bishop captures, knight captures on f3, bishop captures on, let's say, rook e8. It seems like black is developing well. No, black is still just lost. And regardless of what you play, let's say you capture the bishop, knight captures. Okay, let's say you move the queen to c7, bishop to d5 check. And that's the key point that you had to see all the way to that position. So it was a battle for d5, but also the h5 pawn that is undefended. So now you cannot go to the h file. Queen captures on h5 is just game over. And if king f8 again captures, puts pressure on f5, queen h8, queen f7, the threat of mate in 1. So that is what you have to see at this point where Gukesh played d4. So it's not just a battle for d5, d captures, and c5, d captures e5. Also, the undefended h5 pawn is what is bothering Fabi in this position. So bishop to f7 would go a long way. You get out of range of d5. You also add a defender for that h5 pawn. He's just not in time. So here, Fabi tried pawn to e4, which, we already mentioned that makes perfect sense in the line that we've shown. But here, pawn to d5, Gukesh does not have to go back. E captures on f3, we have bishop captures on f3, and now knight c to e5. D captures on e6, opening up an attack on the queen. Knight captures on f3 with check, queen captures, and queen to e7, going after the passed pawn. And now knight to d5. Gukesh gives up the passed pawn, but unleashes the fury on this diagonal. So queen captures, we have bishop captures on f6, and now knight captures, followed by a spectacular, probably going to use this for the thumbnail, queen captures on f5. And it's not much, but Gukesh is going into an endgame just being up a pawn. You could avoid the queen trade and then, just knight captures on f6, but with the weak h5 pawn, it doesn't really help you all that much. So queen captures on f5, knight to e7 with a beautiful triple fork here. So I like the, as it's aesthetically pleasing, I like the, say it, even though, of course, you 99% of the time will capture a queen unless capturing the rook is somehow mate in one or something. But still, it looks nice. King h7, knight captures on f5, and the Fabi goes rook to c7. Probably readying to double up on the c file so he can play c4, create a passed pawn. Also, the knight will be able to move, so you don't have to worry about rook to d7. So how can Gukesh push for something here? He goes knight d6. And okay, what is the knight doing here? Well, of course, he's inviting rook to d8, and he wants to play e4. The knight will support e4, and then he wants to play e4, e5. That is the game plan here. And then the knight will be an absolute monster on d6. Okay, rook to d8, we have pawn to e4, and now Fabi played rook c to d7. He just put more pressure on the knight, but probably the only way to play here is c4, trying to take advantage of the fact that the rook is guarding the knight here, so you will not be able to, have it both ways. Some like captures, and now you cannot capture because the rook just captures, or you cannot capture here because captures, and then rook captures on d1. Probably you play f3, you have a very, very solid position here, and then, the pawn comes to c3. Maybe, you can make something of this. Still, white is much better. There are no weaknesses in white's position, and you will suffer. But that is the only way to go. Fabi played rook c to d7, and now pawn to e5 by Gukesh, and Fabi goes knight e4. If you're wondering about knight g4, which is definitely a fair question, just go after the pawn here. It again all comes down to the undefended h5 pawn. Gukesh will happily trade, and after, let's say, knight captures, rook captures on e5, rook captures on d6, rook captures, there's always a rook captures on h5 with check in the end. Now you would be up 2 pawns, and of course, in a completely winning position. So after e5, you have to look for something else. We have knight to e4, and now comes rook to e1. Of course, you cannot trade. The rook captures on d1 would happen, so rook to e1. Another thing, maybe, as you guys are perfectionists, rook to d5. But Gukesh also has to keep in mind that Fabi is low on time. So if you see a really good move, you shouldn't allow your opponent to recover. But I'm going to show it because now, again, you are already in position. And now if knight captures on d6, e captures, rook captures, you will first capture on h5. And then after king g6, you will capture on c5. Again, you're up 2 pawns, completely winning. So after knight e4, rook to e1 was played, knight captures on d6, we have e captures on d6, and now we have rook to c8. Guarding on c5 and preparing c4. But interestingly, a move that gives Fabi the best chances here is something that you would never think of, is playing c4 right away. But yeah, which is definitely not beyond Fabi's level. But with a minute on the clock, everything seems far away. Captures, and after rook captures on c4, you capture on d6. You already have the a6 pawn defended, and now if you go after the h pawn, there's always king h6, and now it's not as simple. Now you're just up a pawn, and once g6 happens, everything is nicely defended. The rook defends everything. It would be almost impossible to do something here. So after e captures, there's rook to c8 and rook to e5. The clock is also, a part of the game. King to h6, defending on h5, but now rook c captures on c5. And you have to trade rooks, otherwise you're going to lose the h-pawn as well. So rook captures on c5, we have rook captures and rook captures on d6, and now king to f1. improving the position of the king. You're up only one pawn, but the position is very, very difficult to play. You could go after the a pawn, but then rook to c6 check picks up the pawn and defends the a2 pawn, so you don't really gain anything from it. So rook to e6. Fabi says, all right, I mean, you have to push if you want to win. I'm cutting off your king. Okay, we have pawn to a4. The engine wants to play pawn to b4, saying it's the best move, but, it is in almost every position except the one that Magnus played against Gukesh. There it really wasn't. It's like one of a million where it isn't. So pawn to a4, we have b captures, and pawn to g6. This is Fabi's stronghold. He says, all right, rook is defending both pawns. How will you win this? But it's actually very simple. When you understand chess and when you understand how to play. So Gukesh plays pawn to a5, and now again the problem for Fabi is there's no move. Like you go rook e4, you want to get behind the pawn. White is much faster, and he's going to capture the pawn, defend on a5, and there's nothing that you can do. So, okay, Fabi can always waste moves. He plays rook g7, king g7, king g2. We have rook to f6, cutting off the king from coming to f3. Rook c7 check. We have king h6, and now rook to a7. So the rook is never moving from the 6th rank. Rook to c6, we have king to f3, and rook to e6. So keeping an eye on the pawn, but also sort of cutting off the king. But king f4, you cannot keep the king away forever. Rook to c6, king to e4. If you want to keep defending the pawn, you have to give the king the e4 square. Rook to e6 check, king to d4, and now rook to d6 with check. King to c5, we have rook to d2. Fabi goes after the kingside pawns, but the pawn is already on a5. We have pawn to f4, rook to c2 check, and king to d5. We have rook to d2 check, king to e5, rook to e2 check, king to d5, and rook to d2 check. And now Gukesh decides to go up the board. King c6, rook d3, rook captures on a6. We have rook captures on g3, king b7, and now rook to f3. Preparing to start capturing pawns, Gukesh goes rook to f6. You don't need to defend this pawn, but it's there's also no reason not to. And both of them are now below a minute. Gukesh is even lower on time now. We have king to g7, forcing the rook away from the defense of the f4 pawn, rook to c6, and rook captures on f4. And I could ask you to pause the video here because only one move is winning, but it's a move even your uncle would play, so I'm not gonna, insult you guys. Of course, Gukesh played pawn to a6, and he was in this position on move 59 that Fabiano Caruana resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here. If you probably are thinking, can't we do anything here? Well, no, you can't. I will show a couple of moves like rook b4, you will defend. Okay, we're going to capture the h4 pawn, a7 is coming, rook a4, okay, you can block with the rook to b4 with check, king comes to c6, you go rook c4 check, and after king d5, you go rook c8, and you give up a rook. So let's say captures, and you have two connected pass pawns against the rook, which would go a long way if the king was, for example, on a7. But with the king already on d5, it's not really, I mean, you can push the pawn. Let's say rook to a4 goes after the pawn. You're going to play g5. Now the king comes into the game. Let's say king to g6, rook to g4, king to h5. You defend the rook. And that's it. No more progress can be made for black. If h3 captures whatever you play, king h4, you're going to go rook to g4 check, king h5, and a nice rook to g8, threatening checkmate. So you have to move the king to h4. Now you go king f4, again threatening checkmate, so h2 really doesn't help you. And after king h5, you go king g3, you pick up the pawn, and that's it. So it's, simple. Beyond measure, I would say, for Gukesh and Fabi both. So yeah, incredible stuff, taking down Fabiano Caruana, and you've seen what it was all about. Like, it was all about the disposition. Sorry, obviously not this position where d4 was executed. Fabi played this bishop to f6 move, and this is the critical position, make no mistake. So this is the critical position where Fabi lost the game, where he had to spot that you have to defend the h5 pawn and also combine it with knight b4, and okay, you can push. But without spotting these two ideas, he played bishop to f6, which looks very nice. You're fighting for the d4 square, but he just invited d4, and he completely fell apart. So one weakness that doesn't seem to be a part of the game at all at this point decides the game, because you cannot, win tactically, and you cannot go into an endgame because that h5 pawn always gets picked up. So Gukesh saw this, and he completely obliterated Fabi. Absolutely amazing. And for those of you who maybe haven't seen Gukesh's game against Magnus, I suggest you check it out. We'll even put a first link in the description below so you guys don't have to click unnecessarily. These are the standings after 6 rounds of Rapid have been played. Gukesh in sole first place with 10 points. Jan Krzysztof Duda with 8. Wesley So with 7. Magnus sharing fourth with Ivan Šarić and Anish Giri. With 5, we have Pragnananda and Fabiano Caruana. Alireza in 9th place with 4 points, and Nodirbek Abdusatov last for the moment in 10th place. And also, if you look at this, after losing the first game against Duda, I mean, this is just sensational, or rather, nothing short of sensational. Beating Alireza, Pragnananda, Nodirbek, Fabiano, and Magnus in a row. He has a rating performance of over 3,000, and even though for the moment, he's 2654 in Rapid. He's quickly gaining rating, and I believe we'll see a 2700 Rapid Gukesh before you know it. His next opponent is Anish Giri, so we'll see what happens there. But if Gukesh continues playing like this, I don't think anyone will be able to stop him. So yeah, that's the game. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you want to see the other Gukesh games that we still haven't covered, I could also show them because he's playing at an exceptional level. I would like to thank James Sanderson, Guillermo Ismael Garcia Borges, Phil Bauer, Benjamin Heuberger, and Nikola Nenad Stankovic for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing to check up on your wonderful suggestions and whatever else happens in the chess world. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.